So I thought today I would give you a rundown of the sort of work that I've been doing in my academic life, and also how this academic research has fed into the work that I do now as in the industrial sector. So for most of my career, I was an academic researcher, as mentioned in my introduction. I was a professor at Oxford University, a professor of modelling and epidemiology. And throughout my career as an academic, I always was very interested in how my research could influence policy making in health, but also particularly enjoyed working on solving mathematical problems as well. And so I'm going to give you a presentation about that on a few pieces that are also relevant in the industrial sector where I currently work in the pharmaceutical company GlaxoSmithKline. So I'm going to give you a few case studies where myself and my students and my colleagues have integrated mathematical, statistical and economic methods in order to address real life or real world health problems. I'm going to talk a little bit about malaria and also about COVID-19. So let me start with an example from the field of malaria. Here I want to talk about supporting the investment case for eliminating malaria from the Asia Pacific region. Now, this project came from the organization APLMA, the Asia Pacific Leaders Malaria Alliance, and what they were looking for was a fully evidence-based, quantifiable investment case for eliminating malaria from the Asia Pacific region. And so in order to do that, we needed to build, first of all, a mathematical model, a transmission dynamic model, which was spatially explicit, so multi-patch, multi-country, with the countries interacting with each other, and also multi-species, because in the Asia Pacific, there are two main malaria species, and they're different in the way that they transmit. So we needed a multi-species, multi-country malaria model. And the other element that was absolutely essential to include in this model was economics and costs. And all of those ingredients were brought together in collaboration with a global health finance expert who used this information to put together an investment case for the elimination of malaria from the Asia Pacific. And what you can see here is essentially the output, the results of all of this work. You see this incredible number here of all the different scenarios that we simulated with this model. The reason being that we wanted to express the results of the model in lots of different ways. So we also produced a user interface which allows any user, and particularly not a modeling specialist, it allows them to navigate through all of the modeling scenarios that we ran. And it also gives you some nice summary results. For example, this map here shows what would be the minimum package required of interventions, because you have to use multiple interventions to combat malaria. What would be the minimum package in each country to reach elimination by a particular year? And I think we chose 2030 for that year. And throughout this presentation, you'll see QR codes, and those essentially will take you to papers and publications and so on, in case you would like to see more detail about this work. What I want to show you here is how the mathematics interacted with policy over many, many years to build up a strong evidence base, a strong mathematical modelling evidence base to support malaria elimination in the Asia Pacific, where actually anti-malarial drug resistance was also a major issue in that region. And so, as you can see, we start from even very strongly mathematical approaches, equilibrium analysis. So there were pieces written in the early 2000s, mid 2000s, on the nature of the system, the malaria transmission system, and how mathematically you could explore different options for eliminating and eradicating malaria, and exploit what we understand about the mathematics underpinning the transmission. We also showed that a simple set of differential equations could reproduce almost all the behaviors that were shown in the more complex mathematical models for malaria transmission, including individual-based models and all sorts of very complicated models. We showed that a well-written set of differential equations could essentially give you most of the same information. And then there were a whole bunch of other pieces that came together that ultimately led to a mathematical modelling system that was sufficiently robust to support investment cases and decision making for malaria elimination in a large global region like the Asia Pacific, and actually beyond as well into Africa also, and South America. And as you can see, there were many applications, all starting from that equilibrium analysis all the way through to these policy-facing pieces. So next, I'd like to talk about something that we did recently, and I noticed that in the room you have my colleague, Professor, Emmanuel Afolabi, and so this is something that Emmanuel collaborated with us on. This is the COVID-19 Modelling Consortium. So during the COVID pandemic, a group of us came together from many countries around the world to work together to use mathematical modelling to support decision making for different countries around the world for how to address the COVID-19 problem, which is very different in different countries. There are different age structures of the population in different countries. There are different sets of interventions that are realistic for that country, for that culture, for that economic setting. And so as a group, we produced a shared model which allowed mathematicians and other people who came and wanted to use modelling to adapt this model or compare it with their own model to explore COVID-19 in their own countries. And one of the things that one of the principles we had for this is that it should be people, modelers in their own countries, doing their own models to support their own decision making. And you can read more about the Como Consortium, or ask Emmanuel about more information about that particular event and endeavor. What I can show you here is that similar to the malaria approach, we hid the maths behind an accessible user interface. Why did we do that? Because this is policy-facing modelling, and it was a very complex system that would be impossible to explain and discuss in detail during an emergency. So we decided that the best way would be to have a user-friendly interface and allow, and of course publish the model in full and in detail as well for scientific robustness. But for the use for policy making, this user interface was extremely useful for not just the decision makers, but also for the modelers, some of whom had only just started doing modelling and were suddenly in a position where they were advising their Minister of Health or even their president. And here's an example of one of those, the work of one of those new modelers, Ainura Moldok-Matova, now Dr. Ainura Moldok-Matova, who was a PhD student when she began using the Como model and working with her Minister of Health in her home country of Kyrgyzstan. So what about a different approach, also policy facing? Now, in this case, this is a piece that we did to explore the potential impact of a treatment for COVID-19 called Dexamethasone. And this treatment was for people who were already hospitalized, and it was to reduce their risk of dying of COVID once they were already in hospital with COVID-19. And it was requested, in this case, it was UK modelers working for their country, because it was requested and used by the UK Prime Minister's office. We produced a different kind of model. This was not a transmission dynamic model. We used a static model, a static economic model, in order to estimate, make a sort of, how would you say, conservative estimate of how many lives could be saved with this drug, both in the UK and also globally. So the results are here, and what I want to show you particularly about this modelling approach was that although this tree diagram can look quite complicated, it is simply a product of multiple probabilities, and so at the end of each branch is just the product of each of these. At the end of each, branch here is a product of each of these minor branches, so the benefit of that is that you can actually write the entire model on one page, and so this gives complete transparency and reproducibility, which was a priority for our partners. So here's another approach. So now we've talked about transmission dynamic modeling. We've talked about simple static economic models, and now I'm going to talk about a sort of combination of a dynamic approach, a sort of semi-mechanistic statistical approach, or what I call here a mechanistically influenced statistical approach. So what was the question here? The question here was when the COVID pandemic in the UK started, there were no reliable tests available because COVID was a new disease. So we suspected, sort of the orange line, this is the data, we suspected that the data was being underreported in the first wave of the COVID pandemic in the UK. And so how did we interrogate this hypothesis? How did we test this hypothesis using mathematics? Well, what we did have later on was, well, actually quite early on, was serology data. So we had, there were two pieces of data that were quite robust and informative, and one of them was serology data, so testing people's blood, a random group of people testing their blood at these different points during the pandemic, a random sample of people, and having a look to see how many people had antibodies for COVID-19. And then we also, now if those antibodies did not wane, if they did not leave a person's body, then the antibody, the serological prevalence, the seroprevalence, would actually be the equivalent of all of the people that had been exposed. Because if you've been exposed, you've got antibodies, and so you just have a look at what percentage of people have got antibodies, and you know who's been exposed. However, in the case of COVID-19, people would be infected, they would produce an antibody response, and then those antibodies would decay over time and ultimately leave their body. So someone testing negative for antibodies could mean that they had never been exposed, or it could mean that they had been exposed but quite a long time ago and they'd already lost their antibodies. So if you combine antibody data with mortality data, which is also very well recorded in the UK, then you would have something that could tell you, those two things together could tell you how much exposure there had actually been. And that's what we did. And I'll show you the equations in a moment. And what we predicted here was the amount of exposure that had happened. And opposite to the orange line, which starts off with a low peak and then has a higher peak later in the second wave, our model predicted that the first peak was very much underreported and was probably much, much higher in the first wave than it was in the second wave. And what you can see here are is the mathematics that goes that underpins this this result. And what we used was essentially we needed to understand the timeline of individuals who become exposed, and then they get symptoms, and then after they have symptoms, they can go through all of these stages. Some after they have symptoms, only some of them get symptoms, and of those who get symptoms, only some of them get severely ill. And of those who get severely ill, again, only a few of them unfortunately die of COVID. And that happens 3 weeks after exposure. Coincidentally, if someone has been exposed and they did not get severely ill and die, then that's around the same time as they would start testing positive for antibodies when they recover from their infection. So we exploited this result in order to produce this this equation here for those who are exposed. Now, at the same time, we have this quantity alpha, which is called the infection fatality ratio, which indicates of all what is the proportion of all people who are exposed who would die. So you can include this, and then you have you're able to include the mortality data in your formula, and so you now have your mortality data, and um, you have your zero reversion rate, and by fitting this formula to the seroprevalence over time, we are able to estimate both the rate of seroreversion and the infection fatality ratio. And we were able to do that long before other methods were available to do the same thing. And I'm happy to say we got it right. How much more time do I have? Hello? Would you like to hear about malaria, COVID-19 during pregnancy?
10 minutes, 10 minutes, 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yeah,
Okay.
10 minutes. 10.
Yes. Okay, great. In that case, I'll very briefly show you what we did for this one. So this is building on the model, the mechanistic statistical approach we used before, and adding a differential, a set of differential equations. And the idea here was to estimate how effective it was for shielding during pregnancy. Now, I don't know if it was the same case in Nigeria and other countries in the African continent, but in New York and in the UK, women who were pregnant during the COVID pandemic were advised to reduce their contact with other people during their pregnancy, and we didn't know how effective that could be. There was no randomized controlled trial to tell us how effective that was. But what we do have is a situation where women, some women would have been giving birth after the epidemic wave all women who were giving birth after the epidemic wave, some of those would have started shielding before the wave because they're pregnant for 8 to 9 months. And then those sort of 8 or 9 months after the wave had occurred would have started shielding after the wave. And so what you can see here is if you can work out the difference between these two populations, you've got the effectiveness of that intervention. So that's what we were trying to estimate. And we used a set of differential equations to do it. So we started here. So these are people who were negative for both the virus and their antibodies. Then they get infected and then they become positive for the virus, but they still haven't raised antibodies. So they're negative for the antibodies. Then they seroconvert, and there's a period of time where they're positive for both virus and antibodies. And then they get rid of the virus and recover. And now they're but they're still positive with their antibodies, and then eventually they revert and they lose their antibodies as well. So the beta here is the same beta that I was using previously, the rate of seroreversion. And so using this approach, we were able to combine this model with our previous model and estimate what the effectiveness of shielding was. And we got, I think it was about 40 or 50% of infections were blocked with this method. So to conclude, in the field of real world evidence and health policy, mathematical methods are particularly useful when you're combining different disciplines together, and they can really add value to the evidence that we already have from field studies and other more traditional methods of data collection, because you can combine data sets together and you can pull out information that you wouldn't normally directly measure. They're not a substitute for the standard approaches, but they do give more information. They do add value. They might give a direction to go in for more research. And so ideally, these methods are used hand in hand with field and laboratory research to essentially give a bit of foresight and to help explore which avenues are worth pursuing in terms of real world evidence. And in order to do this kind of work, you need a combination of skills. You need both the mathematical knowledge and the understanding of different technical disciplines, but also an understanding of the of what are the big pictures in terms of real world epidemiology, health policy, and so on. What are the big questions that need answering? What are the data gaps? What's important to explore? What data are there? And in order to do all of that, you need a multidisciplinary group, and collaboration and communication are essential. So that's it from me. I hope that gives you some insights into the kind of work that I've been doing and what can happen in the world of health and health policy and pharmaceuticals using applied mathematics. Thank you.